The Book of Judges, chapters 1 through 7. Chapter 1. After the death of Joshua, the children of Israel inquired of the ever-living, "Who shall lead us against the Canaanites, to make war with them?" The Lord replied, "Judah shall go up, and I will give the country into his power." Judah, however, said to Simeon his brother, "Go up with me to my district, and we will fight with the Canaanites, and then I will go with you to your district." So Simeon went with them. Judah accordingly went up, and the ever-living gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their power, and they defeated them in Bezek, with a loss of 10,000 men. Then they met the prince of Bezek at Bezek, and fought with him, and defeated the Canaanites and Perizzites, and the prince of Bezek fled. But they pursued after, and captured him, and cut off the thumbs of his hands and feet. Then the prince of Bezek said, 7 kings, with the thumbs of their hands and feet cut off, were waiters beside my table. As I did, God has repaid to me. They afterwards brought him to Jerusalem, where he died. The children of Judah next besieged Jerusalem, and captured and conquered it by the edge of the sword, and delivered the city to fire. After that the sons of Judah proceeded to make war with the Canaanites who occupied the hills, the south, and the pastures. Then Judah marched against the Canaanites who held Hebron, and defeated Sheshai, and Achiman, and Thalmai, and marched from there to the possessors of Debir, where Caleb said, "Whoever conquers Krith Sepher and captures it, I will give him my daughter Achsah for a wife." So Othniel, the son of Kenaz, the younger brother of Caleb, captured it from them, and he gave Achsah his daughter to him as a wife. Now as she was coming, he suggested to her to ask an estate from her father. So she dismounted from her ass, when Caleb asked her, "What do you want?" And she replied, "Give me a blessing. With the southern land you have given me, give me springs of water." So Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. The sons of Kenai, the father-in-law of Moses, had come up from the city of the palm trees with the sons of Judah into the desert of Judah, which is to the south of Arad, and marched and lived with that people. Then Judah went with Simeon his brother, and conquered the Canaanites inhabiting Zephath, and destroyed it, and called the name of the town Carmah. Judah also captured Gaza and its district, and Ashkelon and its district, and Akron and its district, for the ever-living was with Judah, and he took possession of the highlands. But they could not drive out the population of the plains, because they had iron chariots. Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had promised, and he drove the 3 sons of Anak from it. But the Jebusites continued in Jerusalem, for the sons of Benjamin could not drive them out. So the Jebusites continued to reside with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. The house of Joseph also went up to Bethel, and the ever-living was with them. So the house of Joseph was successful against Bethel. The name of the town was formerly Luz. And the scouts saw a man who came out from the city, and said to him, "Show us, we pray, the entrance into the town, and we will reward you." So he showed them an entrance to the city, and they took the city with the sword, but they sent the man away with all his family, who went to the country of the Hittites, and built a town and called it by the name of Luz, and it bears that name to this day. Manasseh also did not disperse the people of Bethshan with its villages, and Thanak with its villages, or the inhabitants of Iblam with its villages, or the population of Megiddo with its villages, but permitted the Canaanites to reside in that country. But when Israel prevailed, it laid the Canaanites under tribute, and did not expel them. Ephraim also did not expel the Canaanite population of Gezer, or the Canaanite population from around Gezer. Zebulun also did not expel the population from Kittan, the inhabitants from the riverside, or the Canaanite population from amongst itself, but put them under tribute. Ashur did not expel the population from Akkah, or the inhabitants of Zidon, or Akbal, or Akzib, or Kabdah, or Aphik, or Rekob, but the Ashurites resided amongst the Canaanite population of the country, for they did not expel them. Naphtali did not dispossess the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the population of Beth Anath, but resided amongst the Canaanite population of the country. And the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath were tributary to them. The Amorites also resisted the sons of Gad in the highlands, although they were not able to descend to the plains. Therefore they allowed the Amorites to occupy the eastern hills at Ailon and Shaalbim, and Thikbod alongside the house of Joseph, and they paid tribute. And the boundary of the Amorites was from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upwards. Chapter 2. But a messenger of the ever-living came from Gilgal to Bochim, who said, I brought you up from Mitzrayim, and conducted you to the country which I promised to your ancestors, declaring, I will not break my covenant with you forever, but you shall not make a treaty with the inhabitants of this country, but strike down their altars. However, you have not listened to my voice. Why have you done so when I said, if you do not drive them out from you, they will be thorns, and their gods will be snares to you? When the messenger of the ever-living addressed this speech to the parliament of the children of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept, and called the name of that valley the Weepings, and sacrificed there to the ever-living. When Joshua dismissed the people, the children went each to his share, to take possession of the country, and the people served the ever-living all the days of Joshua, and all the time of the old men who survived Joshua, who had seen all the great acts of the ever-living which he did for Israel. Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the ever-living, died at 110 years of age, and they buried him within the bounds of his estate, at Thimnath, in Mount Ephraim, on the north of the hill of Gash. But when all that generation were added to their fathers, there arose another generation after them who knew not the ever-living or the acts which he did for Israel. Then the children of Israel did wrong in the sight of the ever-living, and passed over to Baal, and forsook the ever-living God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of the Mitzrayim, and went after the gods of the nations who surrounded them, and worshipped them, and provoked the ever-living. Thus they forsook the ever-living, and worshipped Ashtaroth. Then the anger of the ever-living burnt against Israel, and he gave them to the hand of robbers who robbed them, and delivered them to the power of their enemies all round, and they were not able to stand before their enemies. Wherever they went, the hand of the ever-living was against them for evil, as the ever-living had said, and as the ever-living had threatened them, and he greatly afflicted them. The ever-living afterwards raised up judges who protected them from the powers of the robbers. Yet, however, they would not listen to their judges, for they went whoring after other gods and worshipped them, turning soon from the path which their fathers followed, that of listening to the commands of the ever-living. They did it not. But when the ever-living caused some of the judges to arise, and the ever-living was with that judge, he saved them from the hand of their enemies, for the ever-living pitied their groans under their adversaries and oppressors. But when that judge died, they turned and corrupted themselves more than their fathers, by following seducing gods, and serving and worshipping them. They ceased not from their offenses, and from making their way hard. Then the anger of the ever-living burnt against Israel, and he said, Because this nation has broken my covenant which I communicated to their ancestors, and does not listen to my word, I also will not continue to drive out before them any of the nations whom Joshua left at his death, so that I may try Israel by them, whether they will keep the path of the ever-living and walk in it as their fathers kept it, or not. So the ever-living gave them not those nations, and did not dispossess them of the mountains, and gave them not to the hand of Joshua. Chapter 3. And these are the nations whom the ever-living permitted to try Israel, all who are not acquainted with the wars of Canaan, so that the generations of the children of Israel might learn war, which they otherwise would not have known. The 5 lordships of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and Zidonians, and the Hivites, inhabiting the hills of the Lebanon, from the hill of Baal-Hermon to the pass of Chemath. They were also to try Israel, to teach them to listen to the commands of the ever-living, which he dictated to their fathers by the hand of Moses. So the children of Israel resided amongst the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and took their daughters to themselves for wives, and gave their daughters to their sons, and served their gods. The children of Israel also did wrong in the sight of the ever-living, and forsook their ever-living God, and served Baalim and Ashtaroth. The anger of the ever-living consequently burnt against Israel, and he delivered them to the power of Cushan-Ramathim, king of Aram between the rivers, and the children of Israel were subject to Cushan-Ramathim for 9 years. Then the sons of Israel cried to the ever-living, and the ever-living sent a Savior for Israel, in Othniel the descendant of Kenaz, the youngest brother of Caleb, who saved them, for the spirit of the ever-living was upon him, and he judged Israel, and went out to war. And the ever-living gave Cushan-Ramathim to his hand. Thus the country had peace for 40 years, until Othniel ben Kenaz died. The children of Israel, however, continued to do wrong in the sight of the ever-living. So the ever-living emboldened Eglon, king of Moab, against Israel, because they did wrong in the eyes of the ever-living. And he added to himself the children of Ammon, and Amalek, and Zabin, and defeated Israel, and seized the town of palm trees. The sons of Israel consequently served Eglon, king of Moab, 18 years. Then the children of Israel cried to the ever-living, and the ever-living raised a Savior for them, Ahud ben Gera, a Benjaminite, a left-handed man, by whose means the sons of Israel sent the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. But Ehud made himself a sword of a foot long with a double edge, and bound it under his cloak on his right thigh, when he approached with the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Eglon, however, was a very fat man. And when he had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who carried the tribute. But he returned back from the quarries that are in Gilgal, and said, I desire a word in private between myself and you, king. And he replied, All right, and sent away all who stood about him. Then Ehud came to him, and he sat upon the raised seat which was reserved for himself alone, and Ehud said, There is a message from God with me for you. So he rose from his throne. Then Ehud stretched out his left hand, and drew the sword from his thigh, and drove it into his belly, and the excrement came out after the blade, but the fat closed up over the blade, for he did not draw the sword from his belly, but it went into the intestines. Then Ehud went out by the private porch, and shut the door after him, and locked it. But when he was gone, the servants came and looked, and saw the door of the chamber locked, and said, Perhaps he is lying down in the chamber of his summer house. So they waited until they were alarmed, and seeing no one open the door of the retreat, at length they took a key and opened the door, and saw their prince fallen on the earth dead. But Ehud escaped while they delayed, and passed the quarries, and ran away like a tempest, and then went on and blew a trumpet in Mount Ephraim, and the children of Israel flocked to him from the hills, and he became their leader, and said to them, Follow after me, for the ever-living will give your enemies the Moabites into your hand. So they followed after him, and captured the fords of the Jordan leading to Moab, and permitted no man to pass over. They also cut off from Moab at the same period about 10,000 men, all stout men of valor, and not a man escaped. Moab was consequently from that time subjected to the hand of Israel, and the land was at rest 8 years. And after that came Shamgar the son of Anath, who slew 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad, and delivered Israel. Chapter 4. But the children of Israel continued to do wrong in the sight of the ever-living. Therefore the ever-living delivered them to the power of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Katzor, the commander of whose army was named Sisera, and he resided in Karshith of the heathen. But the children of Israel cried to the ever-living, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and oppressed the Israelites cruelly for 10 years. At that time a woman, Deborah, a distinguished teacher, was a judge in Israel, and Deborah sat under the palm tree of Deborah, between Ramah and Bethel and Mount Ephraim, and the Israelites went to her for decisions. But she sent and summoned Barak the son of Abinoam from Kadesh of Naphtali, and said to him, Has not the ever-living God of Israel ordered you? Go and encamp on Mount Tabor, and collect 10,000 men to you from the sons of Naphtali and the sons of Zebulun, and I will draw Sisera, the commander of the army of Jabin, with his chariots and his great numbers to you at the river Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hand? But Barak replied to her, If you will go with me, I will go, and if you will not go with me, I will not go. And she answered, I will go with you. However, the road you go shall not lead to your honor, for the ever-living will give Sisera to the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh, where Barak invited Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 men came to his feet. And Deborah went up with him, and Heber the Kenite, who was descended from Kien, one of the sons of Hobab, a father-in-law of Moses, who had also pitched his tent at Alon Betzanim near Kadesh. And it was reported to Sisera that Barak bin Abinoam had occupied Mount Tabor. Sisera consequently summoned all his charioteers with their 900 chariots of iron, and all his forces from Karsheth of the heathen to the river Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak, Arise, for this is the day when I will deliver Sisera to your hand. Does not the ever-living go before you? So Barak descended from Mount Tabor with the 10,000 men following him, and the ever-living routed Sisera with all his chariots and all his troops, with the sword before Barak, so that Sisera descended from his chariot and fled on foot. But Barak pursued the charioteers and the infantry to Karsheth of the heathen, and stormed all the camps of Sisera by the sword, not sparing one. Sisera, however, fled on his feet to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between Jabin, king of Katzor, and the house of Heber the Kenite. And Jael came out to meet Sisera, and said to him, Turn in, prince, turn in to me, fear nothing. So he entered with her into the tent, and she covered him with a cloak. Then he said to her, Let me have a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. And she opened him a bottle of milk, and gave him a drink, and covered him up again. Then he said to her, Stand before the door of the hall, and if any man comes to inquire of you, and says, Is there anyone here? Answer, There is no one. Jael, the wife of Heber, however, took a peg of the tent, and grasped a hammer in her hand, and went to him secretly, and fixed it on his temples, and drove it through to the earth, for he was fast asleep. So he expired and died. Then she saw Barak pursuing Sisera. So Jael went out to meet him, and said to him, Come, and I will show you the man whom you seek. And he went with her, and saw Sisera lying dead, with the nail through his temples. Thus God defeated on that day Jabin, king of Canaan, before the Israelites, and the power of the children of Israel increased, advanced, and strengthened over Jabin, king of Canaan, until Jabin, king of Canaan, was subdued. Chapter 5. Then Deborah and Barak ben Abinoam sang, saying, Deborah. For freedom in Israel, you heroes and people bless the Lord. Barak. Let kings hear, let princes listen. I to the Lord myself will sing. I chant to the ever-living God of Israel. The troops. Lord, in your advance from Seir, in your march through the field of Edom, the earth shook, the heavens poured down, the storm clouds poured out water. The mountains melted before the Lord, Sinai itself before the living God of Israel. Deborah. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Yael, the caravans ceased, and travelers went in the bypaths. Judges ceased, in Israel ceased, till I, Deborah, arose, a mother to Israel. Barak. They chose for themselves new gods. When there was war at the gates, was a shield or a spear to be seen in 40,000 of Israel? Deborah. My heart can picture Israel. Heroes among the people bless the Lord. The troops. You riders upon white asses, and you who dwell in the plain, and the travelers by roadways publish, with the sound as of rushing waters, the kindness the Lord has done, the kindness to Israel's hamlets, when the Lord's force rushed down to the dales. Barak. Arise, arise, you, Deborah, awake, awake, and utter a song. Deborah. Arise, Barak, and conquer, conqueror, son of Abinoam. Let the nobles and people descend. The Lord sent me to summon heroes. Come to me, Ephraim, rooted in Amalek. Follow me, Benjamin, from your caves. Come to me, Machir, with your chieftains, with Zebulun wielding the writer's pen, and Issachar's eloquent princes. And along with Issachar, Barak, who directs the march with skill. My heart aches for Reuben's absence. Why stayed he among the sheepfolds to hear the cries of his flocks? My heart aches for Reuben's absence. Gilad remained beyond the Jordan. But why stayed Dan in his ships?
and Ashur rest on the shore of the sea, and continue to lie in his ports. Zebulun's men risked their lives to death with Naphtali from the highlands.
Barak. Kings came out to the war, like Canaan's kings at Thanak, who fought by the brook of Megiddo. They took no silver as plunder. The stars they fought from the skies. The stars from their high course fought against Sisera. The river Kishon swept them away, that ancient river, the river Kishon.
Deborah.
Rush strongly along, my life. How the hoofs of the horses sound with their mighty leapings and prancings. Curse Meroz, said the man of the Lord. When cursing, curse its people. For they came not with help to the Lord, to help the Lord and his heroes. But bless the children of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Bless all the sons of her tent. He asked her water. She gave him milk. She offered him butter on a beautiful dish. Then she stretched her hand to the nail, her right hand to the workman's hammer. And Sisera pierced through his head, and broke and drove through his temples. At her feet he bowed, fell down. At her feet he bowed, fell down. When he bowed, he fell down dead.
The troops. Sisera's mother at the evening hour bent and watched from her window. What prevents his chariot's return? What delays the tramp of his chargers? Her wise women answered to her, nay, continued her words to herself. Have they not found plenty of plunder, a lovely girl for the generals, and a plunder of robes for Sisera? A plunder of robes embroidered robes for the necks of the victors? Deborah, Barak, and troops.
Lord, thus destroy your foes.
But let your friends march on, like the sun in his glory.
After this the country rested for 40 years. Chapter 6. Then the Israelites did wrong in the eyes of the ever-living, so the ever-living gave them to the hand of Midian 12 years. And the power of Midian was so strong over Israel that the Israelites made for themselves entrenchments in the mountains, and caves, and towers. And if the Israelites sowed, then Midian and Amalek and the Beni Kedem came upon and assailed them, and wasted the whole breadth of the country to the pass of Gaza, and left no means of subsistence for Israel, or sheep, or ox, or ass. For they, and their cattle with them, advanced with their tents, coming in such immense numbers, both of themselves and their camels, that they could not be counted, and went over the country, destroying it. Thus Israel was thoroughly exhausted before Midian. Then the children of Israel cried to the ever-living, and when the Israelites cried to the ever-living on account of Midian, the ever-living sent a man, a preacher, to the sons of Israel, and he said to them, The ever-living God of Israel says thus, I brought you from the Mitzrayim, and brought you from the house of bondage, and delivered you from the power of your opponents, and swept them before you, and gave you this country. Then I said to you, I am your ever-living God. You shall not reverence the gods of the Amorites in whose country you reside, but you would not listen to my voice. Afterwards the messenger of the ever-living went and sat under the oak which is at Ophrah, belonging to Joash, and Gideon his son was threshing wheat in a wine cellar, to hide it from the Midianites. And the messenger of the ever-living looked in at him, and said to him, The ever-living is with you, brave man. But Gideon answered him, What, sir? If the ever-living is with us, then why has all this come? And where are all his wonders that our fathers related to us, telling about the bringing us up from Mitzrayim? For now the ever-living has forsaken us, and put us under the foot of Midian. But the noble man turned to him and replied, Go with your courage and rescue Israel from the hand of Midian. Have I not sent you? He, however, returned, Me, sir? How can I rescue Israel? The regiments of Manasseh have failed, and I am the youngest of my father's family. But the noble man answered to him, Because I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites like a single man. Then he asked him, If now I have found favor in your eyes, and you have done me the kindness of speaking with me, do not remove from here until I come back to you, when I will bring my present and present it to you. So he replied, I will sit down until you return. Then Gideon went and killed a goat's kid, and baked an unfermented cake, and placed the meat on a tray, and put the broth in a basin, and brought to him under the oak, and presented it. Then the divine messenger said to him, "Take the meat and the biscuit, and ascend to the peak of Luz, and pour out the broth." And he did so, when the messenger of the ever-living extended the end of the staff which he had in his hand, and touched the meat and the biscuit, and fire came from the rock and consumed the meat and the biscuit. Then the messenger of the ever-living went from his sight, and Gideon perceived that he was a messenger from the ever-living. So Gideon exclaimed, "Ah, great Lord, I have certainly seen a messenger of the ever-living face to face." And the noble replied to him, "Peace to you, fear not, you will not die." Consequently Gideon built there an altar to the ever-living, and it is called the Ever-living's Peace to this day. It is near Aphrath of Eleazar. In the night again the ever-living said to him, "Take the bull of your father's herd, and a second 7-year bull, and overthrow your father's altar to Baal, and break the shrine that is beside it, and build an altar to your ever-living God, on the top of this refuge on the mound, and take the 2 bulls, and offer as a burnt offering with the wood of the shrine which you have broken up." So Gideon took 10 men of his servants, and did as the ever-living told him. But because he feared his father's family and the men of the village, he could not do it by day, so did it by night. When they arose in the morning and observed the altar of Baal thrown down and the shrine that was near it broken, and the 2 bulls burning upon the altar he had built, then each said to his neighbor, "Who has done these things?" So they examined and inquired, and were told, "Gideon the son of Joash has done them." The people of the village consequently said to Joash, "Bring out your son and let him die, for he has overthrown the altar of Baal, and has broken the shrine that was by it." But Joash replied to all who stood about him, "Would you defend Baal? If he can help you, then he can defend himself. If he is a god, he can kill for himself this morning. Let him defend himself for the overthrowing of his altar." So they named him at once Jerubbaal, saying, "Let Baal destroy him, for he overturned his altar." In consequence, the forces of Midian and Amalek and the Beni Kedem assembled together and encamped in the plain of Jezreel. But the spirit of the ever-living descended upon Gideon, and he blew the trumpet and summoned the Abiezerites after him, and sent messengers to all Manasseh, and also summoned them after him. And he also sent messengers to Ashur and Zebulun and to Naphtali, and they went up to meet him. Then Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you promised, I will lay this fleece of wool on the level floor. If the dew is on the fleece only, and dryness upon all the ground, then I shall understand that you will save Israel as you have promised." And he arose in the morning and wrung the fleece, when as much dew ran from the fleece as filled a bucket with water. Gideon, however, said to God, "Let not your anger burn against me, and I will speak once again. I will try another time with the fleece. Let it now be dry on the fleece only, while there is dew on the ground." So the ever-living made it thus that night. There was dryness in the fleece only, and upon the ground there came dew. Chapter 7. Then Jerubbaal, who was Gideon, arose, and all the people who were with him, and encamped in the well at Karod, overlooking from the north the camp of Morah upon the plain. But the ever-living said to Gideon, "There are too many people with you for me to give the Midianites into your power, for fear Israel should glorify against me and say, 'My hand has saved myself.' Therefore now proclaim in the hearing of the people, and say, 'Who is afraid and timid? Let him return and depart to Mount Gilead.'" Consequently 22,000 of the people departed, but there were left 10,000. But the ever-living again said to Gideon, "The people are too many. Order them down to the brook, and there select for yourself, and whoever replies to you thus, 'I will go with you,' let him go with you. But all who say, 'I will not go with you,' let him not go with you." So he took those men with him down to the brook, where the ever-living said to Gideon, "All who lap with the tongue from the brook like a dog laps, place them by themselves, and all who bend on the knees to drink." And the number of the lappers from the hand to their mouths was 300 men, but all the rest of the people knelt on the knee to drink from the brook. Then the ever-living said to Gideon, "With the 300 men who lapped, I will rescue you and give Midian into your hand." So the people took their staves in their hands, and their clothing, and all the force of Israel went off to their homes, except those 300 brave men. And the camp of Midian was opposite those in the plain. And night came. Then the Lord said to him, Arise, descend to the camp, for I will give it to your hand. But if you fear the descent, go down with Phurah your squire to the camp, when you will hear what they say, and after that embolden your hand. He therefore descended to the camp, and Phurah his squire went down with him to the officers' quarters, who were over the camp, where Midian and Amalek and the Beni Kedem were spread over the plain like locusts for number, and their camels were innumerable like dust scattered on the shore of the sea for multitude. But Gideon proceeded, and perceived a man relating a dream to his comrade, who said, I have dreamed a dream, when I saw a round barley cake thrown into the camp of Midian, and it went to the general's pavilion and struck it, and it fell. But it bounded forward, and another pavilion fell. Then his comrade answered and said, That is nothing less than the sword of Gideon ben Joash, the man of Israel. God will give Midian and all this camp into his power. But when Gideon heard this dream related, and its interpretation, he bowed down and returned to the camp of Israel, and said, Arise, for the Lord will give the camp of Midian to your hands. Then he divided the 300 men into 3 divisions, and all of them took trumpets in their hands, with dark lanterns and lamps inside the dark lanterns. And he said to them, Watch me, and what I do, you do the same. And when I come to the edge of the camp, what I do then, you also do it. When I blow my trumpet, then all of you blow your trumpets with me all around the camp, and shout, The sword of the Lord and of Gideon! Then Gideon and the 100 men with him went to the headquarters side of the camp, where the officers were stationed, and sounded the trumpet, and opened the dark lanterns they carried. The 3 divisions also blew their trumpets, and waved their dark lanterns, and rushed on with the lanterns in their left hands and the trumpets in their right, blowing and shouting, The sword of the Lord and of Gideon! And halted outside around the camp, and aroused all in the camp, who fled in terror. But the 300 continued to blow the trumpets, and the ever-living turned the sword of each against his comrade in all the camp. And the camp fled in confusion to the edge of the meadows of Necholah, near Tabath. The man of Israel afterwards summoned Naphtali and Asher, and all Manasseh, and they followed after Midian. Gideon also sent messengers to the whole of Mount Ephraim to say, Descend to meet Midian, and capture from them the fords at Beth-barah and of the Jordan. So they called out every man of Ephraim, and captured the fords at Beth-barah and at the Jordan, and captured the 2 princes of Midian, Oreb and Zaeb, and killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and executed Zaeb at the winepress of Zaeb, and continued the pursuit of Midian, but they brought the heads of Oreb and Zaeb to Gideon from beyond the Jordan. The end of chapters 1 through 7 of the book of Judges. Recording by Mark Penfold. The book of Judges, chapters 8 through 14. Chapter 8. The men of Ephraim, however, asked him, Why have you done this business for us, and not consulted us? For you have gone to war with Midian, and continued with it rashly. But he answered, What have I done now more than you? Are not the gleanings of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has given to your hand the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zaeb. So what have I been able to do more than you? Then turn your spirit away from me when speaking about this matter. Then Gideon went beyond the Jordan himself and the 300 men with him, weary, yet pursuing, and said to the people of Succoth, Give, I entreat you, a little bread to the men who are with me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing after Zebach and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. But the masters of Succoth replied, Are the hands of Zebach and Zalmunna in your power, that we should give you any bread? Gideon, however, retorted, When the ever-living gives Zebach and Zalmunna into my power, then I will inform your governors with thorns from the desert and with briars. From there he went to Phanuel, and asked them the same. But the men of Phanuel answered like the men of Succoth. So Gideon also replied to the men of Phanuel, When I return with peace, I will throw down this towering Phanuel. Now Zebach and Zalmunna were encamped at Karkar with about 15,000 men, all they had left them, but with the whole camp of the Beni Kedem, 120,000 infantry, accomplished swordsmen. Gideon consequently advanced by the lower road to the general's pavilion from the east of Nobach and Yagba, and attacked the camp whilst the camp was resting in security. Zebach and Zalmunna, however, fled, and he pursued them and captured both the kings of Midian, Zebach and Zalmunna, and all the camp was thrown into confusion. When Gideon ben Joash returned from the war, coming up from the desert, he captured a young man from the people of Succoth and questioned him, and he described to him the chief men of Succoth, and the 7 aldermen and the 7 councilmen. Then he advanced against the people of Succoth and said, Here are Zebach and Zalmunna, about whom you insulted me, saying, Is the hand of Zebach and Zalmunna in your power yet that we should give bread to your weary men? Then he seized the aldermen of the town, and informed the people of Succoth with the thorns and briars of the desert. Next he threw down the tower of Phanuel, and killed the chiefs of the village. Then he asked Zebach and Zalmunna, What sort of men were they whom you murdered at Thabor? And they replied, Like yourself, each one in appearance like the distinguished son of a king. When he answered, They were my brothers, sons of my mother. As God lives to me, if you had spared their lives, I would not have killed you. Then he said to Jether, his firstborn, Get up and kill them. But the youth did not draw his sword, because he was afraid, for he was only a lad. So Zebach and Zalmunna said, Get yourself up and assail us, like a man in his vigor. Gideon then arose and killed Zebach and Zalmunna, and took the crescents that were upon the necks of their camels. The men of Israel afterwards said to Gideon, Rule over us, you and your son and your descendants, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian. But Gideon replied to them, I will not be governor over you, nor shall my son govern you. The ever-living is your governor. But Gideon said, I request each of you to give me a ring from your plunder. For as they were Ishmaelites, they wore gold rings. And they replied, We will give you that gift. So he spread his cloak, and each threw upon it a ring from the plunder, and the gold rings which he asked were 1,700 shekels in weight, besides the crescents and eardrops, and cloaks, and the woven shawls of the king of Midian, and the necklaces which were on the necks of the camels. Gideon afterwards made a suit of armor of them, and set it up in his village at Ophrah, but all Israel whored after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and all his house. Midian was thus subdued before the Israelites, and it did not again raise its head, so that the country had rest for 40 years in the time of Gideon. Jerub-Baal ben Joash, however, returned to his home, and Gideon had 70 sons produced from his loins, for he had many wives. But his secondary wife, who was in Shechem, bore him also a son, and his name was Abimelech. Then Gideon ben Joash died with good gray hair, and they buried him in the tomb of Joash his father, in Ophrah of Abiezer. But when Gideon ben Joash was dead, the Israelites went again and whored after Baal, and chose Baal-bereth as their god. For the Israelites remembered not their ever-living God, who redeemed them from the power of all their enemies around, nor did they act kindly to the family of Jerub-Baal Gideon, for all the good he had done for them. Chapter 9. Abimelech went to Shechem, and spoke to them, and to all the clan of the house of his mother's father, to say, I wish you to whisper to the ears of the Baalites of Shechem, What good is it to you, this government of 70 men, all the sons of Jerubbaal, compared to the government of a single man? And remember that I am your bones and flesh. So his mother's relatives whispered all these things about him to the ears of all the Baalites of Shechem, and turned their hearts after Abimelech, for they said, He is our countryman. They therefore gave him 70 shekels from the house of Baal-berith, with which Abimelech hired 70 vagabonds and reprobates, and they followed him. Then he went to the house of his father in Ophrah, and murdered his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men, upon a single stone, except Jotham ben Jerubbaal the youngest, for he hid himself. Then all the Baalites of Shechem and the house of Miloah proceeded and went and made Abimelech king, to reign in Allon, the garrison of Shechem. When this was reported to Jotham, he went and stood on Mount Gerizim, and raised his voice, and called to them, and said,
Listen to me, you Baalites of Shechem, and let your gods listen. The trees once went out to elect a king over themselves, and they said to the olive, Will you be king over us? But the olive replied to them, Shall I resign my fatness, with which gods and men are delighted, to trouble myself about trees? Then the trees said to the fig, Come and be king over us. When the fig replied to them, Shall I abandon my pleasantness and beautiful fruit to go and trouble myself about the trees? Next the trees said to the vine, Come and be king over us. But it answered them, Shall I abandon my wine which delights gods and men, and go and trouble myself about the trees? Then all the trees said to the bramble, Come, you reign over us. And the bramble answered the trees, If you really consecrate me as your king, come here, shelter under me. And if you will not, fire shall go out from the bramble and consume the cedar of Lebanon. So now, if in truth and uprightness you have made Abimelech your king, and if you have done handsomely to Jerubbaal and to his family, and if you have done to him according to the work of the hand of my father, who fought for you, and poured out his soul for you, who have risen upon my father's family today, and murdered 70 persons on a single stone, and have elected Abimelech, the son of his slave, over the Baalites of Shechem, because he is your relative, then according to the truth and justice with which you have acted towards Jerubbaal and towards his family today, be content with Abimelech, and let him be content with you. But if not, let fire come out from Abimelech, and consume the Baalites of Shechem and the house of Manoah, and let fire come out from the Baalites of Shechem and from the house of Manoah, and consume Abimelech. Then Jotham fled and hid himself in Barah, and stayed there from the presence of Abimelech his brother. When Abimelech had been a chief in Israel for 3 years, the ever-living sent a bad feeling between Abimelech and the Baalites of Shechem. Consequently, the Baalites of Shechem plotted against Abimelech. The injury done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal, and their blood, returned upon Abimelech their brother, who had murdered them, and upon the Baalites of Shechem, who encouraged his hand to the murder of his brothers. So the Baalites of Shechem laid an ambush upon the tops of the mountains, and they robbed all who passed near them in the road, and it was reported to Abimelech. Then Gaal ben Abd came to Shechem with his brothers, and passed into it, and the Baalites of Shechem confided in him, and went out and reaped their vineyards, and pressed them, and afterwards made a feast, and went to the house of their god, and ate and drank, and cursed Abimelech. Then Gaal ben Abd exclaimed, Who is Abimelech? And what was Shechem that we should be enslaved? Is he not the son of Jerubbaal, and Zebul his lieutenant? They were slaves, those furious low-bred bastards, but why should we be enslaved? But if this people were under my hand, I would turn Abimelech off. Then he shouted against Abimelech, Collect your army, and meet me outside. When Zebul, the commandant of the city, heard of the speech of Gaal ben Abd, he was furious, and sent messengers to Abimelech at Tharma, to say, I find Gaal ben Abd and his brothers have come to Shechem, and that your rivals in the town are against you. So now get up by night, you and all the force with you, and hide in the fields, and at dawn, when the sun rises, advance and attack the city, and then you and the force you bring with you can do to him whatever you find in your power. Abimelech consequently arose that night, and all his force with him, and they advanced secretly against Shechem in 4 divisions. But Gaal ben Abd went out and stationed himself outside the gate of the town. Then Abimelech and the force with him arose from their ambush, and Gaal saw the force, and asked Zebul, Is that an army descending from the top of the hills? When Zebul replied to him, You see the shadow of the mountains instead of men. But Gaal continued to speak, and said, Look, it is a force that descends from the highlands, and 1 division comes from the road of Alon Maonim. Then Zebul replied to him, Where now is the mouth which said, Who is Abimelech, that we should be enslaved? Is not that the man whom you despised? Now go and fight with him. Gaal consequently went out with the Baalites of Shechem, and fought with Abimelech. But Abimelech repulsed him, and he fled before him, and many fell wounded before the gate of the town. Abimelech then retired to the highlands until Zebul advised Gaal and his relatives against remaining in Shechem. So when morning came, his army went out to the fields, and he reported it to Abimelech. So he took his force and divided it under 3 leaders, and lay in ambush in the fields, and watched until the army had come clear of the town, when he arose and assailed it.
Then Abimelech and the officers who were with him rushed and seized the open gate of the town, and the 2 other leaders charged upon all who were in the fields and repulsed them, whilst Abimelech assailed the town all that day, and captured it, and killed the people who were in it, and threw down the houses, and sowed it with salt. When all the Baalites of Shechem tower heard of it, they went to the tower of the house of their god, Berith, and it was reported to Abimelech that all the Baalites had assembled at Shechem tower. Abimelech consequently ascended Mount Zalmon with all his force, where he took an axe and cut boughs from the trees, and hoisted them upon his shoulder, and said to the people who were with him, "What you have seen me do, be quick and do the same." So all the army each cut a branch, and marched after Abimelech, and piled them against the tower, and set the tower on fire with them, and thus killed all the people in the tower of Shechem, about 1,000 men and women. Then Abimelech marched to Thebets, and besieged Thebets, and captured it. But there was a strong tower in the middle of the town, and all the men and women fled there, and shut themselves in, and went to the roof of the tower. Abimelech, however, advanced to the tower and assailed it, and approached close to the door of the tower to consume it with fire. But a woman threw an upper millstone upon the head of Abimelech, and broke his skull. When he immediately called to the youth who carried his arms, and said, "Draw your sword, and kill me, for fear that they should say, 'A woman killed him.'" So his squire drew, and killed him. And when the men of Israel saw Abimelech was dead, each returned to his home. Thus God turned upon Abimelech the wrong which he did to his father in murdering his 70 brothers. God caused all the wickedness of the men of Shechem to return upon their heads, and brought the curse of Jotham the son of Jerubbaal upon them. Chapter 10. After Abimelech, a man of Issachar, Thola ben Phua, arose to save Israel. He resided in Shamar on Mount Ephraim, and judged Israel for 13 years, when he died and was buried in Shamar. Then Jair the Gileadite arose after him, and judged Israel for 12 years, and he had 30 sons who rode upon asses, and they possessed 30 villages, called the villages of Jair to this day. They are in the country of Gilead. When Jair died, he was buried in Kamon. Then the children of Israel repeated the doing of evil in the sight of the ever-living, and served the Baalim and Ashtaroths, and the gods of Aram, and the gods of Zidon, and the gods of Moab, and the gods of the sons of Aram, and the gods of the Philistines, and forsook the ever-living, and did not serve him. So the anger of the ever-living burnt against Israel, and he gave them up to the hand of the Philistines, and to the power of the people of Ammon, who crushed and oppressed the children of Israel, who were in Bashan beyond the Jordan, in the country of the Amorites, and in Gilead, for 18 years. The Amorites also passed over the Jordan to make war with Judah and Benjamin, and the house of Ephraim, and ravaged Israel greatly. Then the children of Israel cried to the ever-living, saying, "We have sinned against you, for we have forsaken our God and served the Baalim." But the ever-living replied to the children of Israel, "Have you not the Mitzrites, and the Amorites, and the Beni Ammon, and the Philistines, and the Zidonians as refuges from oppression for yourselves, that you call to me to save you from their hand, when you have forsaken me and served other gods? Therefore I will not continue to save you. Go and call the gods whom you have chosen for yourselves. Let them save you in the period of your distress." The children of Israel, however, said to the ever-living, "We have sinned. Do to us all that is good in your sight. Oh, save us now today." And they put away the foreign gods from amongst themselves, and served the ever-living, and he stayed his anger against Israel. Then the Ammonites assembled and encamped in Gilead, and the children of Israel collected and encamped in Mitzvah. But the army said to the chiefs of Gilead, "We have not a man to lead us. Let the man who is able to fight with the Ammonites be the head of all the inhabitants of Gilead." Chapter 11. Now Jephthah the Gileadite was a heroic man, but he was the son of a foreigner who bore Jephthah to Gilead. His Gileadite wife also bore him sons, and that woman's sons grew up and drove Jephthah out, and said, "You shall not inherit with the family of our father, for you are the son of a foreigner." Jephthah consequently fled from the presence of his brothers, and lived in the country of Tob, where Jephthah collected vagabond fellows who came to him. This was in the time when the Ammonites were at war with the children of Israel. So the judges of Gilead went to bring Jephthah from the district of Tob. And they said to Jephthah, "Come and be our leader, and fight for us with the Ammonites." But Jephthah replied to the judges of Gilead, "Did you not hate me and drive me from the house of my father? Then why should you come to me now that you are in distress?" The judges of Gilead, however, answered Jephthah, "In spite of that, return now with us and fight the Ammonites, and you shall be the chief of all the inhabitants of Gilead." Then Jephthah said to the judges of Gilead, "If I return with you to fight the Ammonites, and the ever-living gives them to my advance, am I to be your chief?" And the judges of Gilead answered Jephthah, "Let the ever-living decide between us if it is not done as you say." Jephthah thereupon went with the judges of Gilead, and the people appointed him over themselves as a chief and leader, and Jephthah took the oaths before them in Mizpah. Then Jephthah sent messengers to the king of the Ammonites to say, "What is there between me and you, that you have come to fight me in my country?" When the king of Ammon answered the messengers of Jephthah, "Because Israel when coming up from the Mitzrayim seized my country from Arnon to the Jabbok and the Jordan, but you can go back to them in peace." But Jephthah sent messengers again to the king of the Beni Ammon, and said to him, Jephthah replied thus, "Israel did not seize the country of Moab and the country of the Beni Ammon, for in the coming up from the Mitzrayim Israel went in the desert by the Red Sea, and came to Kadesh, when Israel sent messengers to the king of Edom to say, I wish to pass over by your country. But the king of Edom and the king of Moab replied that they were not willing. Therefore Israel halted at Kadesh, and marched into the desert, and went round the land of Moab, and encamped at the river Arnon, and did not invade the bounds of Moab, for the Arnon was the boundary of Moab. From there Israel sent ambassadors to Sihon, the king of the Amorites, king of Heshbon, and said to him, I, Israel, would pass through your country to my place. But Sihon would not trust Israel to pass through his boundaries. So Sihon collected all his forces, and encamped at Jotz, and fought with Israel. The ever-living God of Israel, however, gave Sihon and all his army to the hand of Israel. And Israel conquered all the country of the Amorites residing in that region, and acquired all the region of the Amorites from the Arnon to the Jabbok, and from the desert to the Jordan. And since the ever-living God of Israel has driven the Amorites before his people, yet you would possess. Cannot you possess what Chemosh your God has caused you to possess? And whatever our ever-living God has caused us to possess, we shall possess for ourselves. And now, are you better than Balak bin Ziphor, the great king of Moab? Greater than Israel? If you can fight with them, fight with them. Israel, however, has dwelt in Heshbon and its villages, and in Aroer and its villages, and all the towns along the Arnon 300 years. So why have you not recovered them during that period? And I myself have not offended you, but you have done wrong to me in making war upon me. Let the ever-living as judge decide today between the children of Israel and the Beni Ammon." But the king of the Ammonites would not listen to the words that Jephthah sent to him. Then the spirit of the ever-living came upon Jephthah, and he passed through Gilad and Manasseh, and advanced to Mizpah of Gilad, for Mizpah of Gilad was in subjection to the Beni Ammon. Therefore Jephthah vowed a vow to the ever-living, and said, "If you will deliver the Beni Ammon to my hand, then whatever first comes out of the doors of my house to meet me upon my returning with peace from the Beni Ammon shall be the Lord's, and shall be offered as an offering." Jephthah then advanced against the Beni Ammon to fight with them, and the ever-living gave them into his power, and he conquered from them Aroer, and as far as the pass of Minnith, 20 villages, and onwards to the vine fields, a very great conquest. Thus the Ammonites were subjected to the children of Israel. When, however, Jephthah returned to Mizpah to his home, his daughter came out to meet him with timbrels and dances, and except her alone there was no child to his house. So when she approached him, he tore his robes, and said, "Alas, my daughter, you have overwhelmed me with sorrow, and you are my grief. For I have opened my mouth to the ever-living, and I am not able to go back." But she answered him, "My father, if you have opened your mouth to the ever-living, do to me according to what has come out from your mouth, since the ever-living has made a triumph for you over your enemies, the Beni Ammon." Then she asked her father, "Grant this thing to me. Give me 2 months that I may go and wander on the hills, and lament for my maidenhood, I and my friends." And he replied, "Go." and sent her away for 2 months. So she and her friends went and lamented over her girlhood upon the mountains. But at the end of the 2 months she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed, and she knew no man. Thus it became an institution in Israel that from year to year the girls of Israel should go to celebrate the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite, for 4 days yearly. Chapter 12. But the men of Ephraim assembled and advanced northward, and demanded of Jephthah, "Why did you proceed to war with the Ammonites, and not invite us to go with you? We will burn your house over you with fire." But Jephthah replied to them, "There was a great contention between myself and the people with me, and the Beni Ammon and I applied to you, but you did not save me from their power. When I saw that you would not save, I took my life in my hand, and advanced against the Ammonites, and the ever-living gave them into my power. Then why do you ascend today against me to fight with me?" Consequently Jephthah assembled all the army of Gilead, and fought the Ephraimites, and the men of Gilead defeated Ephraim. Then the men of Gilead said to themselves, "Ephraim will escape between the Ephraimites and Manassites." So they captured the fords of the Jordan from Ephraim, and when any one of the fugitives of Ephraim said, "I wish to pass over," the men of Gilead replied to him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" And if he answered, "No," they replied to him, "Say, Shibboleth." And he responded, Sibboleth, for he was not able to pronounce it. Then they seized and slew him at the fords of the Jordan. So there fell at that time 42,000 of the Ephraimites. Jephthah afterwards judged in Israel for 6 years. Then Jephthah the Gileadite died, and was buried in the city of Gilead. After him Ibzan the Bethlehemite judged in Israel, and he had 30 sons, and 30 daughters sent out. And 30 daughters came in to his sons from without, and he judged Israel 7 years. Then Ibzan died, and they buried him in Bethlehem. Then Elon the Zebulunite judged in Israel after him, and he judged in Israel 10 years. Then Elon the Zebulunite died, and they buried him in the country of Zebulun. But after him Abdon ben Hillel the Pirathonite judged in Israel, and he had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 asses, and he judged in Israel 8 years. Then Abdon ben Hillel the Pirathonite died, and they buried him in Pirathon in the country of Ephraim, in the mount of the Amalekites. Chapter 13. Then the children of Israel repeated the doing of wrong in the sight of the ever-living. So the ever-living delivered them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. But there was a remarkable man of Zara, of the family of Dan, and his name was Manoah, but his wife was barren; she was childless. A messenger of the ever-living, however, appeared to his wife, and said to her, "Look now, you barren and childless woman, you shall conceive and bear a son. But guard yourself, and drink neither wine nor beer, and eat no grapes. For you shall conceive and bear a son, upon whose head no razor shall go. For the youth shall be a Nazarite to God from his birth, and he shall be strong, and save Israel from the hand of the Philistines." The woman therefore went and said to her husband, "A man from God has come to me, and his appearance was like a messenger of God, very bright. But I did not ask him if he was so, and he did not tell me his name, but he said to me, 'See, you shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall not drink wine or beer, nor eat any grapes, for the youth shall be a Nazarite to God from his birth to the day of his death.'" So Manoah entreated the ever-living, and said, "Let the man whom you have sent appear God to me. Let him come again to us, that we may learn what the youth who is to be born must do." The ever-living therefore listened to the voice of Manoah, and the messenger of God came again to the woman when she was sitting in the field, and Manoah her husband was not with her. But the woman hastened and ran and informed, and said to him, "The man who came the other day to me has appeared to me." So Manoah arose and followed his wife, and came to the man, and asked him, "Are you the man who spoke to this woman?" And he replied, "I am." Then Manoah said, "May your word come true. What does the ever-living decide what the youth shall do?" And the messenger of the ever-living answered to Manoah, "Your wife must abstain from all that I said, from all that comes from the vine. She shall not eat of the vine, she shall not drink wine, and she shall not drink beer. She shall also eat no grapes. She must abstain from all that I have commanded."
Then Manoah replied to the messenger of the ever-living, "Stay here, and I will present to you a goat's kid." But the messenger of the ever-living replied to Manoah, "If I stay, I will not eat of your bread, but if you make an offering to the ever-living, offer it." For Manoah did not know he was a messenger of the ever-living. Then Manoah asked the messenger of the ever-living, "What is your name, that I may come to you and bless you?" But the messenger of the ever-living asked him, "Why do you ask my name, when it is Wonderful?" Then Manoah took a goat's kid and a bread offering, and went up on the rock to the ever-living, and set the offering apart. And Manoah and his wife watched them. But when the flame went up from the altar to the skies, the messenger of the ever-living also went up in the flame of the altar. And Manoah and his wife saw him, and they fell upon their faces to the earth. The messenger of the ever-living, however, did not again appear to Manoah or his wife, after he had recognized that he was a messenger of the ever-living. Manoah consequently said to his wife, "We shall die, for we have seen a god." But she replied to him,
"If the ever-living intended to kill us, he would not have received a burnt offering from our hands. And we should not have seen all this, and he would not have listened to us as he has." The woman afterwards bore a son, and called his name Samson. And the lad grew great, and the ever-living blessed him, and the mighty spirit of the ever-living impelled him to the camp of Dan, between Zarah and Ashtal. Chapter 14. But Samson descended to Thimnath, and saw a woman in Thimnath, a Philistine girl. So he returned and told his father and mother, and said, "I have seen a woman in Thimnath, a Philistine girl, so I wish you to obtain her as a wife for me." But his father and mother replied, "Is there not a girl related to you, or a woman in all your nation, that you should go and take a wife from the foul Philistines?"
Samson, however, exclaimed to his father and mother, "Get her for me, for she is perfect in my eyes." For his father and mother did not know that it was given to him from the ever-living to seek a wife from the Philistines, although at that period the Philistines governed in Israel. Consequently Samson and his father and mother descended to Thimnath. Once formerly, when he had gone to the vineyards of Thimnath, a young lion had roared at his approach, and the spirit of the ever-living had fallen upon him, and he had torn it in two like tearing a kid, but had not told his father or his mother what he had done. So they went down and spoke to the woman, who was perfect in the eyes of Samson, and stayed some time for the marriage. But he went aside one day to look at the carcass of the lion, and observed a swarm of bees in the skeleton, and honey. So he took some into his hand, and walked along, and ate as he walked with his father and mother. Then he gave them some, and they ate, but he did not tell them that he had taken the honey from the skeleton of a lion. Afterwards, when his father came down to see his wife, Samson made a feast, as young men are accustomed. He had visitors also with him, and he chose 30 friends who were to stay with him, and Samson said to them, "Let us agree together to ask riddles. If you can guess mine in the 7 days of the feast, and relate it, I will give you 30 shirts and 30 suits of clothes. But if you are not able to guess it for me, then you shall give me 30 shirts and 30 suits of clothing." When they replied to him, "Tell your riddle, and we will listen." So he said to them, "There came meat from the eater, and from the strong came sweetness." And they were not able to guess the riddle by the 3rd day. But when the 7th day came, they said to Samson's wife, "Open your husband, and explain the riddle for us, or we will burn you and destroy your father's house with fire unless you tell it to us." Samson's wife consequently wept to him, and said,
"You hate me now, and do not love me. You have not explained that riddle to me and my relatives."
But he answered her, "I have not explained it to my father and mother, so why should I explain it to you?" She consequently wept over him the 7 days that the feast lasted, and when the 7th day came, he explained it to her, for she wore him out, and she explained it to her relatives. So the men of the village said to him at the end of the 7th day at sunset, "What is sweeter than honey? And what stronger than a lion?" But he replied to them, "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle." Then the spirit of enthusiasm came upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon, and killed there 30 men, and took their clothing, and gave the suits to the guessers of the riddle. But he was furious, and went off to the house of his father.
The wife of Samson, however, was left with the companions who had accompanied him. The end of chapters 8 through 14 of the Book of Judges. Recording by Mark Penfold. The Book of Judges, chapters 15 through 21. Chapter 15. Afterwards, when the time of wheat harvest came, Samson visited his wife with a goat's kid, and said, "I wish to go to my wife's chamber." But her father would not allow him to enter. Her father also remarked, "I said to myself, he hates her, so I have given her to your friend. Is not her younger sister handsomer than she? I will give her to you instead of her." Samson, however, replied to him, "I will be revenged this time on the Philistines for doing me wrong," and went out and caught 300 foxes, and took torches, and tied their tails together, and fixed a torch between the two tails, then fired the torches, and sent them amongst the cornfields of the Philistines, and burnt the shocks and standing corn, and the olive yards. When the Philistines inquired, "Who has done this?" they were told, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Thimnite, because he took his wife and gave her to his companion." The Philistines therefore went up and burnt her and her father with fire. But Samson said to them, "Because you have done this, I will be revenged upon you, and then I will cease." So he smote them hip and thigh with a great slaughter. Then he went and occupied a cavern in the precipice of Aitan. The Philistines afterwards went up and encamped in Judah, and advanced to Balki. When the men of Judah asked, "Why have you advanced against us?" they replied, "You must hand over to us Samson for us to do what we intend to him." 3,000 men therefore went from Judah to the cavern in the precipice of Aitan, and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines govern us? Then why have you done this to us?" When he replied, "As they did to me, I have done to them." But they answered him, "We have come to bind you and give you to the hands of the Philistines." Samson only said to them, "Swear to me that you will not assail me yourselves." So they replied to him, saying, "We will only bind you and deliver you to their hands, and we will not kill you." Then they bound him with 2 new ropes and hoisted him down from the cliff. But when they came to Lechi, and the Philistines shouted at his approach, and enthusiasm fell upon him, and he smashed the manacles that were upon his arms like burnt flax, and snapped the cords off his hands, and finding the fresh jawbone of an ass, he put out his hand and seized it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson exclaimed, "With the jawbone of an ass I have made them asses. With the jawbone of an ass I've slain 1,000 men." And as he ceased speaking, he threw the jawbone from his hand, and named the place Jahil. Then he was terribly exhausted, and cried to the ever-living, and said, "You have given this great victory to the hand of your servant, and now I shall die for thirst, or fall by the hand of the uncircumcised." Then God opened the well at Balki, and water came from it, and he drank, and his spirit returned to him, and he survived. Therefore he called its name Prayer Well, which is in Balki to this day. He afterwards judged in Israel during the Philistine period 20 years. Chapter 16. Samson once went to Gaza, and saw a woman, a harlot, and went to her. The Gazites said, "Samson has come." So they surrounded and laid an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city, and waited all the night, saying, "At dawn of day we will kill him." But Samson lay down till midnight. Then he arose at midnight, and pulled up the doors of the city gate with the 2 posts, and the crossbar, and placed them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that is opposite Hebron. And after this he loved a woman in the vale of Shorek, and her name was Delilah. So the lords of the Philistines went to her, and said, "Pump him, and find out in what his great strength consists, and in what way we can master and chain him to destroy him, and we will each give you 1,100 shekels." Delilah consequently said to Samson, "Tell me now in what your strength consists, and in what way they can bind and destroy you." And Samson answered her, "If they bind me with 7 wet ropes that have never been dried, I shall become feeble like an ordinary man." So the lords of the Philistines brought to her 7 wet ropes that had never been dried, and she bound him with them, while an ambush hid in her chamber. Then she exclaimed to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he snapped the ropes as he would snap a thread of tow burnt in the fire. Consequently his power was not discovered. Therefore Delilah said to Samson, "I see you are laughing at me and telling me lies. Tell me now, how can I bind you?" So he replied to her, "If I am bound with fresh willows that have not been used in any work, I shall become feeble and be like a common man." Delilah accordingly took fresh willows and bound him with them, and then exclaimed to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson!" And an ambush was laid in the chamber. But he snapped them off his arms like a thread. Delilah afterwards said to Samson, "So far you have laughed at me and told me lies. Tell me, how can I bind you?" And he answered her, "If the 7 plaits of my hair are woven in a loom." So she fastened them to the loom, and exclaimed to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson!" when he awoke from his sleep and pulled up the pins of the loom with the web. Then she exclaimed, "What? Do you say you love me when your heart is not mine? These 3 times you have laughed at me, and not told me in what your great strength consists." So when she had worn him out by talking every day, and worried and exhausted his life to death, he told her the whole of his heart, and said, "A razor has never gone upon my head, for I was devoted to God from birth. If I were shaved, then my strength would leave me, and I should become feeble like another man." Then Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, and she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, "Come up now, for he has told me all his heart." The lords of the Philistines consequently went up to her, and they brought the money with them. And she laid him asleep on her lap, and called to a man who cut off the 7 plaits of his head, and broke and degraded him, and his strength went from him. Then she exclaimed, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson!" And he awoke from his sleep, and said, "I will go out for once, for a time, and refresh myself." But he did not know that the ever-living had left him. The Philistines then seized him, and put out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza, and bound him in chains, and he ground at the mill in the prison with slaves. But he awaited the growing up of the hair of his head that had been shaved. Meantime the lords of the Philistines prepared to sacrifice a great sacrifice to Dagon their god, and to triumph. For they said, "Our God has given Samson our enemy into our power." They therefore showed him to the people, and praised their God, for they said, "Our God has given our enemy into our power, who wasted our country, and who caused us much trouble." And when their hearts were delighted, they exclaimed, "Bring Samson, and let him make sport for us." So they brought Samson from the slaves' prison, and he made sport before them, and they placed him between the pillars. Then Samson said to the warder who had him by the hand, "Come near to me, and place me by the pillars upon which the building is supported, that I may rest myself on them." Now the building was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there, and about 3,000 men and women looking at the sport of Samson. Then Samson prayed to the ever-living, and said, "Ever-living God, remember me now, and strengthen me this time also, my God, and I shall be at once revenged for my 2 eyes upon the Philistines." Then Samson grasped the 2 central pillars, upon which the building was supported, one with his right, and the other with his left hand, and Samson exclaimed, "Perish my life with the Philistines!" and bent with might, and the building fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed with his death were more than he had killed in his life. His relatives and all the house of his father descended, however, and carried him away, and buried him between Zara and Eshtaol in the tomb of Mano his father. But he judged in Israel 20 years. Chapter 17. There was a man in Mount Ephraim named Micah, who said to his mother, "Those 1,100 of silver which were taken from you, and about which you cursed and swore in my hearing, I have your money. I stole it." And his mother replied, "The ever-living bless you, my son." So he returned the 1,100 of money to his mother, when she said to him,
I had consecrated that money to the ever-living on account of my son, to make an image and a shrine, but now I will give it to you.
He, however, returned it to his mother. But he took 200 of the money, and gave it to a silversmith, who made an image and a shrine, and it was in the house of Micah, and Micah made it a house of gods, and made an ephod and a teraphim, and also set aside one of his sons, and he was the priest to it. There was no king in Israel in those days. Each did what was right in his own eyes. There was also a youth of Bethlehem, Judah, in the clan of Judah, but he was a Levite, who resided there. And the man went from the village of Bethlehem, Judah, to settle where he might find a home, and he came to Mount Ephraim, to the house of Micah, in making his journey, when Micah asked him, From where do you come? And he answered, I am a Levite from Bethlehem, Judah, and I am going to settle in Asher. But Micah said to him, Stay with me as a father and a priest, and I will pay you 10 silvers a year, and a suit of robes, and your board. So the Levite consented, and the Levite was content to settle with the man Micah, and the youth became to him as one of his sons. Micah also appointed the Levite, and the young man became his priest, and lived in the house of Micah. Consequently Micah said, Now I know that the ever-living will prosper me, because I have got a Levite for a priest. Chapter 18. There was no king in Israel in those days. Each did what was right in his own eyes. At that time the tribe of Dan was seeking itself a district for settlement, for it had not obtained until that period a district amongst the tribes of Israel. The Danites consequently sent 5 men from their clan, all of them bold fellows, from Zara and Eshtaol, to examine the country and search it, and said to them, Go, search the country. So they came to Mount Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. While they were in the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite, and were attracted by it, and said to him, When did you come here? And what do you do here? And for how much? And he answered them, Micah does this and that for me, and hires me, and I am his priest. When they replied to him, Inquire now of God, and learn the result of the journey that we are going upon. And the priest answered them, Go in peace. The ever-living accompanies the way you are going. So the 5 men went and arrived at Lasha, and saw that the people inhabited it in security under the government of Zidon, quietly and securely, and there were no soldiers in the country. It was controlled and administered from Zidon, and they had no troubles for themselves. When they arrived to their relatives at Zara and Eshtaol, they asked, What about them? When they replied, Come on, and let us assail them, for we have seen the country, and it is very beautiful. Go, you idlers, do not delay to march and go to seize the country, for you will come to a quiet people, and a land of extensive forests, which God will give to your hands, a place where there is no want of anything that is upon earth. Consequently from the clan of the Danites there marched from Zara and Eshtaol 600 men, all of them skilled warriors, and they advanced and encamped at Kirith-Jearim in Judah. Therefore they called that place Dan's Camp to this day. It is behind Kirith-Jearim. From there they crossed Mount Ephraim and proceeded to the house of Micah. There the 5 men who had gone to spy the country of Lasha remarked to their companions, Do you know that there is amongst these houses an ephod, and a teraphim, and an image, and a shrine? So now you know what to do. They consequently turned aside, and came to the house of the young Levite, near the house of Micah, and wished him peace, while the 600 men of the Danites, armed with warlike weapons, stood before the door. And the 5 men who had been to spy out the country entered and took the image, and the ephod, and the teraphim, and the shrine. But the priest asked, What are you doing? When they answered him, Be quiet, put your hand on your mouth, and go with us, and be our father and priest. Is it better for you to be priest to the family of one man, or to be priest to a tribe and clan in Israel? So the heart of the priest was satisfied, and he took the ephod, and the teraphim, and the image, and went along with the army, who faced about and marched, and placed the children and baggage and precious things in front of them. When they had proceeded to a distance from the house of Micah, the people who were employed in Micah's family shouted and followed the Danites, and called to the Danites, who turned on them and said to Micah, What is the matter with you that you are shouting? And he replied,
You have stolen the god I made for myself, and the priest, and marched off, so what have I left? And yet you ask me, what is the matter with you? But the Danites replied to him, Don't let us hear your noise, for fear some rough fellows should rush out on you and take your life and the lives of your family. Then the Danites went along their way, and Micah, seeing they were stronger than himself, faced about and returned to his own house. Thus they stole what Micah had made, and the priest who had come to him, and went to Lasha, to a people peaceable and quiet, and assailed them, and burnt their city with fire, and there was no deliverance, for they were far from Zidon, and had no intercourse with any person. They afterward settled in the vale of Beth-Rechob, where they built a town, and called it Dan town, after the name of their ancestor Dan, who was born to Israel. But the name of the place was formerly Lasha. The Danites also set up for themselves the image, and Jonathan ben Gershom ben Masha, he and his sons, were priests to the tribe of Dan until the time of removing from the country, and they worshipped the image that Micah made all the period that the house of God was at Shiloh. Chapter 19. It was also in the period when there was no king in Israel, that a certain Levite resided at the back of Mount Ephraim, and he married a woman of Bethlehem Judah as a second wife. But this second wife deserted him, and went from him to the house of her father at Bethlehem Judah, and was there for a period of 4 months. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak to her heart, to cause her to return and attend him. So he mounted his ass, and went to the house of her father, and saw the girl's father, who was glad to meet him. And his father-in-law, the father of the girl, comforted him, and he stayed with him 3 days, and they ate and drank and rested there. When the 4th day came, they got up in the morning, and he arose to depart. But the father of the girl, his father-in-law, said, Refresh your heart with a little bread, and go after that. So he stayed, and both of them ate together and drank. Then the father of the girl said to the man, Be content now, and stay, and let your heart enjoy itself. But the man arose to go. However, his father-in-law pressed him, so he sat down and stayed there. However, he got up in the morning of the 5th day to go, when the father of the girl said, Comfort your heart, and delay till the turn of the day. So they ate and drank. Then the man arose to go, he and his wife and servant. But his father-in-law, the father of the girl, said, See now, the day is stretching towards dusk. Lodge now here pleasantly today. Rest then, and enliven your heart, and get up tomorrow morning for your journey, and go to your own home. The man, however, was unwilling to stay, but arose and went, and arrived opposite to Jebus, that is, Jerusalem, where his saddled asses broke down with him and his wife, when they were near Jebus, and the day was nearly ended. So the attendant said to his master, Let us go now, and turn into this city of the Jebusai, and lodge there. But his master said to him, I will not turn to a town of foreigners, where there are none of the children of Israel. Let us pass over to Gibeah. Therefore, he added to the lad, Come, let us enter one of these places, for we will lodge in Gibeah, or in Ramah. So they passed on, and marched, and came to the south side of Gibeah of Benjamin. And they turned towards it to go and lodge in Gibeah, and went and sat in the square of the town, but no person invited them to his house to lodge. At last an old man came from his work in the fields, at dusk, a man from Mount Ephraim, who was a resident in Gibeah, but his wife was a native of Benjamin. Raising his eyes, he saw the man at a distance, in the square of the town, and the old man said, Where do you go, and whence do you come? And they replied to him, We are crossing from Bethlehem Judah to the back of Mount Ephraim, from where I am. But I came to Bethlehem Judah, and I am returning to the house of the ever-living. But no man has invited me to his house, although we have straw and provender for our asses, and food and wine for myself and my waiting woman and lad. We want nothing at all except shelter. Then the old man said, Peace be with you. Bring your asses with you to me, only do not lodge in the street. So he took them to his house, and foddered the asses, and washed their feet, and they ate and drank. They were cheering their hearts, when the men of the town, sons of Belial, surrounded the house, knocked at the doors, and said to the master of the house, the old man, Bring out the man who has come to your house, that we may outrage him. But the master of the house went out to them, and said, No, my friends, do not inflict wrong upon me, I pray, since this man has come to my house. Do not commit this wickedness.
I have 2 maiden daughters and his servant wife. I will bring them out to you, and you can outrage them and do to them what pleases you. But to this man do not such a loathsome thing.
But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his servant wife and sent her out to them outside, and they outraged her, and maltreated her all the night until daybreak, but went away from her at the departure of darkness. Then at the arrival of dawn the woman came, and fell before the doorway of the man's house, where she had been outraged, until daylight. Her master also arose at daybreak, and opened the doors of the house, and came out to proceed on his journey, and saw the woman his servant wife fallen before the house, with her hands upon the doorstep. And he said to her, Get up and come along. But she spoke not. Then he brought the ass, and lifted the woman up, and went to his place, and entered his house, where he took a knife, and seized his servant wife, and divided her corpse into 12 pieces, and sent to all the countries of Israel. And all who saw it said, There has not been, nor has there been seen anything like this from the time the children of Israel came up from the Mitzrayim until this day. Apply yourselves to it, consult, and speak. Chapter 20. All the children of Israel then went out and assembled the parliament unanimously from Dan to Beersheba, and the country of Gilead, to the ever-living at Mizpah, where the chiefs of the people of all the tribes of Israel presented themselves as an assembly of the people before God, with 400,000 men, disciplined soldiers. The Benjaminites, however, heard that the children of Israel had gone up to Mizpah, where the children of Israel asked, Who has committed this crime? And the Levite, the husband of the woman who had been murdered, answered and said, I and my servant wife came to Gibeah of Benjamin to lodge, when the blackguards of Gibeah rose upon me, and surrounded the house at night, purposing to murder me, and they outraged my wife until she died. So I took my wife and cut her to pieces, and sent her to all the land possessed by Israel, because they had committed such a crime in Israel. Now, sons of Israel, apply to the matter, and consult about it. Then all the parliament arose as one man, and exclaimed, Let no man go to his home, nor any man return to his house, for this is what shall be done to Gibeah. We will assail it by lot, and we will select 10 men in 100 from every tribe of Israel, and 100 from 1,000, and 1,000 from 10,000, as a provisional draft of the army for action, and send them against Gibeah of Benjamin, because of the great crime they have committed in Israel. And all the people of Israel shall approach the town as if united in one man. However, the tribes of Israel sent officers to all the tribe of Benjamin to inquire, What crime is this which has occurred amongst you? Therefore now give up those men, sons of Belial, who are in Gibeah, and we will execute them and burn out the crime from Israel. The Benjaminites, however, would not listen to the voice of their countrymen the children of Israel, but assembled from their villages to Gibeah, to prepare for war with the children of Israel. And the Benjaminites at that period could collect from their towns 26,000 disciplined men, besides the inhabitants of Gibeah, and they amounted to 700 chosen men. These 700 skillful men were more than a numerous force. All of them were both-handed at slinging stones to a hair's breadth, and never missed. But Israel stood up, without Benjamin, 400,000 men, all of them disciplined soldiers, men of war. And they arose and advanced to Bethel, and inquired of God, where the children of Israel asked, Who of us shall go up to open the war with the Benjaminites? When the Lord replied, Judah shall open it. The children of Israel accordingly arose at dawn, and camped before Gibeah, and the leader of Israel advanced to fight with Benjamin, and the Israelites proceeded from the camp towards Gibeah. But the Benjaminites came out from Gibeah, and left Israel that day 22,000 men on the ground. The army of the men of Israel, however, were bold, and continued to prosecute the war from the spot they had advanced to on the first day. The children of Israel also went up and wept before the ever-living until the evening, and inquired of the ever-living, asking, Shall we continue to pursue the war with the Benjaminites, our countrymen? And the ever-living replied, Go up against them. The Israelites consequently approached the Benjaminites on the second day, and Benjamin came out to meet them from Gibeah, and they destroyed of the children of Israel on the field 18,000 men, all of whom were trained soldiers. So all the Israelites therefore went up, and all the army came to Bethel, and they wept and sat there before the ever-living. The children of Israel also inquired of the ever-living, and placed the ark of the covenant of God at their right hand. And Phinehas, a descendant of Eleazar ben Aaron, stood before it on the right hand of them, and said, Continue still to go to war with the Benjaminites your countrymen, until defeated. The ever-living also says, Go up, for tomorrow I will give them into your power. But Israel must place ambushes around Gibeah. So the children of Israel advanced against the Benjaminites for the third time, and they approached to Gibeah step by step. And the Benjaminites came out to meet the force, which drew off from the town, and waited for the attack from the victorious army step by step to the highway which leads to the ascent of Bethel, and adjoins to the field of Gibeah, losing about 30 men of Israel. Then the Benjaminites said, We are driving them before us as formerly. But the children of Israel said, We will retreat and draw them from the town to the highway. Then let all the army of Israel arise from their place, and advance from Baal-Thamar. And the ambush of Israel, placed at the locality of the hill moorland, must advance from the south to Gibeah with 12,000 men, the bravest of all Israel, and fight boldly, and they will not know that the stroke of their crime is upon them. So the ever-living discomfited the Benjaminites before Israel, and the Israelites disabled on that day 25,100 men of Benjamin, all disciplined soldiers. For the Benjaminites fancied that they retreated, and that the Israelites gave way to the Benjaminites. But those relied upon the ambush which they had placed on the hill, for the ambuscade kept quiet and lay down upon the hill until they rushed and attacked the whole town with the sword. And it had been arranged with the men of Israel by the commander of Israel, if the ambush succeeded, to send up a cloud of smoke from the town. Consequently the Israelites retreated to the camp, and the Benjaminites, who were encouraged to the attack, wounded about 30 of the Israelites. For, they said, they certainly fly before us, as in the former battles. So they continued their retreat until the ascent from the town of the pillar of smoke. Then Benjamin faced round, and saw it ascending to the sky from all the town. The commander of Israel also turned front, and the Benjaminites were terrified, for they saw the punishment of their crime was upon them, and turned from the face of the Israelites to the way of the desert, and were defeated in the battle, and those who were in the town were destroyed in the midst of it. But the Benjaminites turned their flight from the level way to the refuge of the hills on the west, and there fell of Benjamin 18,000 men, all of them brave fellows. Thence they turned and fled towards the desert to the cliffs of Rimmon, and 5,000 men went up to the cliffs. But they were followed to Giddim, and 2,000 of them slain. Thus all of Benjamin who fell on that day were 25,000 men, disciplined soldiers, all of them strong men. But there turned and fled to the desert to the cliff of Rimmon 600 men, and they held the cliff of Rimmon 4 months. Then the Israelites turned upon the Benjaminites, and they struck with the sword thoroughly from man to beast, and every town they captured they set on fire. Chapter 21. Then all Israel swore in Mitzvah, saying, No man among us shall give his daughter as a wife to Benjamin. Afterwards all the people came to Bethel, and sat there before the ever-living until the evening, and lifted up their voice, and wept a great weeping, and asked, Why, ever-living God of Israel, has this come to Israel, to destroy today one of the tribes of Israel? But when next day came, the people got up and built an altar, and offered a burnt offering and peace offerings. Then the children of Israel asked, Who has not come up to the assembly of all the tribes of Israel before the ever-living? For a great oath has been sworn that whoever came not up to the ever-living at Mitzvah shall be put to death. The children of Israel also grieved for Benjamin their brother, and said, Today a tribe has been blotted from Israel. What shall we do for them to provide them wives, since we have sworn not to give them a supply of wives? So they asked, Is there a single tribe of Israel which has not come up to the ever-living at Mitzvah? And found that no man had come to the camp from Jabesh-Gilead to the assembly. They therefore reviewed the army, and did not find there a Jabeshite from Jabesh-Gilead. The parliament consequently sent there 12,000 chosen men, and commanded them, saying, Go and assail the Jabeshites of Jabesh-Gilead with the sword, both men and boys. But act in this way: you shall destroy every male and every female who has had connection with a man. But they found of the population of Jabesh 400 girls, maidens, who had not known man by connection with a male, and they brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. Then all the parliament sent and addressed the Benjaminites who were on the cliff of Rimmon, and proclaimed peace with them. So the Benjaminites returned, and they gave them the women who came from Jabesh Gilead, but they were not found sufficient. The people therefore grieved for Benjamin, because the Ever-living had made a breach in the tribes of Israel. The lords of the parliament also said, "What shall we do to supply wives? For we have destroyed the women of Benjamin." So they said, "Let Benjamin seize upon the unwilling, rather than a tribe should be blotted from Israel. For we are not able to give them wives from our daughters, because the children of Israel have sworn, imposing a curse on whoever gives a wife to Benjamin." They then made a feast of several days to the Ever-living in Shiloh, which is at the north of Bethel towards the sunrise, on the highway leading up from Bethel to Shechem and near to Libnah. And they also instructed the Benjaminites, saying, "Go and hide yourselves in the vineyards and watch. And when you see the girls come out from Shiloh to dance in the dances, then come out from the vineyards, and each of you catch a wife for himself from the girls of Shiloh, and take them to the country of Benjamin. And if their fathers should come, or their brothers, to complain to us, we will command them to be lenient with you for taking each one his wife by force, because we cannot give to you as at ordinary times." The Benjaminites accordingly did so, and carried off wives to the number of those deficient who stole, and went off, and returned to their estates, where they rebuilt their villages and settled in them. The Israelites also marched from there at the same time to their tribes and clans, so every one came from there to his home. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. The end of chapters 15 through 21, and the end of the book of Judges. Recording by Mark Penfold.